The hush that fell over the scorched fields surrounding King's Landing felt unnatural, as if the very wind had paused to bear silent witness to the aftermath of war. Fires still smoldered among the ruins of collapsed buildings, and a haze of gray smoke lingered under the pallid sky. Once, the city had been proud, its walls gleaming in the sunlight. Now, the great capital was battered, much of its populace scattered or hidden within the labyrinth of ashes and rubble. Daenerys Targaryen stood atop a fractured stretch of the city wall, her silver-gold hair disturbed only by the faintest breeze. Her black leather riding gear still bore the marks of soot and streaks of dried blood, though she remained regal in the posture that had carried her through so many trials. She surveyed the city that had, until recently, defied her. And yet, though she was the conqueror, a tremor of uncertainty coursed through her whenever she glanced toward the sky. Dragons circled above, 3 silhouettes etched against the pale heavens. Once, that very sight had filled her with a surging sense of unity and power. Now she feared the fragile bond she had forged with her children might be fraying. She could see them. Drogon's wings stretched wide, Rhaegal's grace in flight, and Viserion's agile swiftness. All 3 soared like dark leviathans in the smoke-laden air. Drogon had always been her fiercest champion, the mightiest of the 3. He was the largest, inky scales rippling with red highlights. Rhaegal, green and bronze, had grown in quiet determination, always overshadowed by his brother's powerful presence, yet never lacking the strength or the cunning needed to survive. Viserion, the pale cream and gold, soared with unmatched agility, as if dancing upon the currents. The Night King's spear had never found its mark, the terrible fate that haunted her nightmares narrowly avoided. Daenerys could still recall that day beyond the wall when her dragons saved Jon Snow and his men from an army of the dead. In that pivotal moment of rescue, Viserion had been inches from a deadly strike, but Rhaegal had beaten his wings with surprising force, swerving sharply, unsettling the Night King's aim. The ice spear hurtled past them, uselessly embedding itself in a mound of ice. From that day on, Daenerys had known she was blessed or cursed with all 3 dragons still intact, and she had soared home with the sense that the living world still had a chance. And so it had been, for they had later prevailed against the White Walkers, and the grand war for the Iron Throne had followed. Yet these victories exacted a price. In war, the line between conqueror and liberator could twist and distort with every step. Each roar of dragonfire, each castle stormed, each enemy immolated had left a scar on Daenerys' spirit. Standing now on the edge of King's Landing's battered walls, she felt a rare and poignant doubt. From her vantage, she saw Rhaegal skim through a black plume of smoke, emerging with an irritated snap of his wings. Drogon roared, commanding the skies as he had always done. But Viserion did not echo his cry, he kept his silence. Though they were siblings, Daenerys knew each dragon possessed its own mind, its own sense of purpose. Rhaegal, once gentle, had grown more restless of late, rarely content to remain on the ground, sometimes ignoring her calls. Viserion, while still affectionate, had begun to perch away from Drogon, as though forging a distance she could not understand. And Drogon, the greatest of her dragons, seemed vexed, more aggressive whenever his brothers flew too near. The tension between them was subtle, but it was there, an undercurrent that tightened Daenerys' chest. She stroked the hilt of the dagger at her waist, feeling the weight of responsibility that pressed on her. Dragons were the key to her power, the living flame behind her claim to the throne. But they were more than mere tools. They were, in a way, her children, her only children, and the realization that something threatened to set them against each other churned her insides with dread. She heard footsteps behind her, a light gait that she recognized as Missandei's. The young Nathi woman approached with cautious reverence. Though Daenerys no longer boasted the legion of advisors she once had, many had fallen to betrayal or the consequences of battles. Missandei remained, unwavering in loyalty. "Your Grace," Missandei said softly, folding her hands, "the people have gathered in the plaza. They await your word." Daenerys nodded, drawing in a long breath that did nothing to calm her nerves. So many had died. So many had been spared. She was not blind to the fear that shimmered in the eyes of the small folk. She was the breaker of chains, yet to some, she might now be the harbinger of fire. "Very well," she replied, turning from the shattered skyline. "Summon them. I will address them." She paused, her gaze lifting once more to the heavens. Rhaegal and Viserion had drifted apart from Drogon. All three were still there, but the wedge that separated them felt real and growing. She swallowed her unease, silently promising she would see to them later, once her duties of state were done. She descended from the wall and made her way through a gap in the rubble, stepping onto what remained of the street that led toward the plaza. The city guard, remnants of both former Lannister soldiers who had bent the knee and the loyal Unsullied who survived the fight, stood in a tense line to maintain order. The crowd parted as she approached, carrying the hush with them, as though the very presence of the Dragon Queen stifled conversation. Grey Worm stood at attention near the base of an upturned statue. His face bore the stoic resolve of a man who had known too many battles. His spear, impeccably straight, glinted in the faint, ash-smeared light. Daenerys's heart twisted to see him. He had lost so many of his brothers, and the one woman who had captured his heart. That he still stood by her side reminded her that her war was not solely for vengeance, but for the hope of a freer world she had promised. When she halted in the plaza's center, the onlookers circled at a distance. Men, women, children. Many were clothed in rags, their faces gaunt. They were afraid, and well they might be. Her dragon's wrath and her army's might had cracked the very foundation of King's Landing. She had hoped to save them from Cersei's tyranny. Now she needed to prove it was not one tyranny replacing another. She lifted her hands, feeling the weight of the hush. "People of King's Landing," she began, her voice echoing in the unnatural quiet. "I stand before you not as a destroyer, but as your queen. I know the horrors you have endured. I know the fear that might still fill your hearts." She paused, letting her gaze sweep through the crowd. She saw a woman holding a child tight against her hip, and an old man leaning on a cane. Some looked upon her with hope, others with barely concealed terror. "I was taught from a young age that I was meant to rule, to bring justice, peace, and freedom," she continued. "I once believed these things came simply from a crown, but I have learned that they come from the hearts of the people themselves. Together we will rebuild these streets. We will bury our dead and offer comfort to the grieving. We will not bow to fear. I will not allow any queen or king to rise by terror alone. I will strive for more, and I ask you to trust me as I will place my faith in you." She paused again, and the hush persisted. There were no roars of approval, no cheers, simply exhaustion. These people had survived too many changes of power. They had watched kings fall, queens seize control, armies clash, and dragons burn the skies. Yet in some eyes, Daenerys glimpsed a flicker, perhaps not of devotion, but of a battered hope that this time might be different. She motioned to Grey Worm, who barked an order, instructing the Unsullied to distribute what small rations they had managed to salvage or bring in from the outlying farmland. She had no illusions that this would erase the memory of the fire, but it was a start, meager though it might be. She lowered her hands, concluding with a final, simple sentence: "Help one another. In unity, there is strength." Then she turned from the crowd, concluding her address. As she made her way back, Missandei hurried to her side, subdued but optimistic. "They need more time, Your Grace," she murmured. Daenerys offered a weary smile. "I know, and so do we all." She exhaled, tension knotting her shoulders. The conversation with her people was a first step, but only a small one. Her mind wandered again to the dragons. "Has there been any sign of trouble from Rhaegal or Viserion?" she asked in a hushed tone, not wanting to spread alarm among the onlookers. Missandei glanced skyward. "Not trouble, Your Grace, but I've seen them circle, sometimes far from Drogon." Daenerys nodded, halting by a crumbling archway that had once led to a grand courtyard. "I want to see them up close. I need to understand what's happening." Missandei set her hands together. "Of course. Shall I summon the Dothraki to guard you?" "No," Daenerys replied. "I must do this alone." She made her way out past the city gates as dusk approached. The broad field outside, once an expanse of farmland and trade roads, lay burned and churned from the siege. A makeshift pen of sorts had been established for the dragons, though it was more a wide clearing than a pen. Stones had been arranged in a rough circle where her dragons might rest, feed, or watch the horizon. In the hush of twilight, with the red sun sinking beneath the horizon, she saw 3 silhouettes perched around the circle. The closer she drew, the more palpable the tension in the air. Drogon stood at the center, his long neck arched high, black scales gleaming like obsidian. He watched her approach, nostrils flaring to taste the air. Rhaegal had settled to the side, huge tail sweeping the ground in restless arcs, and Viserion perched on a rocky outcrop, wings half-furled. None of them roared or stirred, but the quiet, seething energy of great beasts on the cusp of conflict was unmistakable. Her heart quickened. She moved gently, slow steps that rustled the dusty ground as she murmured to them in High Valyrian. "Dracarys, my loves, Dracarys," she said quietly, though that word of fire no longer commanded them so simply. It was more a reminder of their bond, an echo of the language she had used since they were hatchlings. Drogon let out a low rumble, eyes glowing with what she might have interpreted as jealous guardianship. He had always demanded the central place. He was first to feed, first to roar, first to challenge. Yet Rhaegal had grown nearly his equal in size, and Viserion was not far behind. Rhaegal growled in return, an unusual gesture of defiance. Daenerys swallowed, stepping closer, letting her hand rest gently on Drogon's scaled flank. He puffed a hot breath, as if appeased by her touch. She reached out her other hand, beckoning softly to Rhaegal. For a moment, the green-bronze dragon hesitated. Then he approached, slow and deliberate, wings tensed. Viserion watched from his perch, pupil slits fixed on Drogon and Rhaegal, as if deciding whether to join or keep his distance. Daenerys could not speak their tongue in the way they spoke it, but she knew their mannerisms. She sensed Rhaegal's longing, Viserion's caution, Drogon's simmering possessiveness. They were siblings, yes, but they were also apex predators with instincts centuries removed from domestication. Their bond with her was the only true harness on their primal drives. She murmured words of calm, words of reassurance, for all 3. She reminded them of the hunts they had flown together, the battles they had won, the distances soared across the skies of Essos. Her voice trembled with quiet intensity, for she knew she had to reassert a unity among them that seemed in peril. If they turned on each other, the realm she meant to protect would tremble with greater fear than any war. She saw Drogon's tail lash the dirt, stirring up ashes. Rhaegal angled his head to hiss, not at her, but at Drogon. And from behind, Viserion let out a piercing keen that cut through the darkening sky. Daenerys' heart pounded. She dared to step between Drogon and Rhaegal, pressing a palm to each of their scaled chests. "Shoo!" she breathed, though the trembling of her voice betrayed her own unease. She called their names, the ones she had spoken to them when they were small enough to perch on her shoulder. A long, smoldering moment passed. Then Rhaegal lowered his head, relaxing, and Drogon exhaled a fiery snort, as if conceding to her. Viserion, though, spread his wings and leaped from his perch, landing a short distance away with a rumble that crackled like distant thunder. Daenerys turned, fear flaring that he might attack Drogon. But no, Viserion was not challenging, not yet. He stared at her instead, head cocked, as though caught between resentment and longing. She cooed to him, stepping closer. He allowed her to place a hand on the warm gold tinge of his scales. Relief washed over her, though she suspected this was only a temporary lull. Night descended. Torches flickered along the shattered walls of King's Landing, and the 3 dragons curled in uneasy rest. Daenerys lingered there, refusing the comfort of a bed or even her counsel. She was determined to keep vigil through the night, letting them sense her calm presence. Missandei, from a respectful distance, kept watch as well. Daenerys had faced countless enemies, Slavers, warlocks, undead armies, cunning queens. But none of it felt as personally harrowing as seeing her own dragons on the brink of division. She was their mother, and if they turned on one another, no fortress could contain their fury. The next day brought a cold dawn, the pale sun rising over a city still mired in rubble and despair. Daenerys stirred from the brief doze she'd taken against a fallen column of stone. Drogon was awake already, scanning the horizon with menacing vigilance. Rhaegal had flown off at daybreak, presumably to hunt, leaving a swirl of dust in his wake. Viserion remained near Drogon, though at a cautious distance. Daenerys rubbed her eyes, body aching. She glanced at Missandei, who offered a grim smile. "He left before light, your grace," she said quietly. "He soared toward the western fields." Daenerys nodded. "Let him roam. He needs space." But she worried about what such roaming meant. She considered flying with Drogon to find Rhaegal, to see if she could reassert their bond. But war-torn duties bound her. She still had a city to bring under control and alliances to mend or forge. A queen's responsibilities seldom allowed time to follow personal matters, even when those matters were 3 fearsome dragons. She turned to Missandei. "I must speak with the lords who remain. Prepare the throne room, or what's left of it." Missandei inclined her head. "At once, your grace." Daenerys mounted the steps of the Red Keep, flanked by Grey Worm and a handful of Unsullied. The keep was half in ruins, battered by dragonfire and the catapults that had once rained destruction. The grand hall leading to the throne room had collapsed in places, forcing her to pick her way through rubble. When she finally entered the throne room, she saw that the Iron Throne itself was still standing, though bent and scorched. It loomed like a twisted monument to everything that had transpired in this city. Once, she had dreamed of that throne while wandering the Red Waste, a hungry exile with only 3 baby dragons and a handful of followers. Now it stood before her in all its battered infamy. A delegation of lords and ladies had gathered in what space remained. There was Lord Royce of the Vale, whose face was set in stony neutrality, and a grizzled man from the Stormlands who wore no house colors, having pledged fealty only after the battle. From the Riverlands, there was an older lady whose name Daenerys recalled was Glover Tully, a distant cousin to the main Tully line, and a smattering of minor lords. No Highgarden, for the Tyrells were gone and the new leadership in the Reach had yet to be firmly established. No Dorne, for the Martells were also gone and the region was in upheaval. Daenerys sensed the swirling tension in the air as the nobles regarded her with carefully schooled expressions. She had taken this city by force, and their presence here was more out of necessity than loyalty. She ascended the short flight of steps to the Iron Throne and stood before it, not sitting yet, letting them see that she did not assume victory meant unchallenged rule. "My lords," she said, her voice echoing amid the broken stones. "We stand at the threshold of a new era. The wars have ended, the dead have been defeated, and King's Landing rests in my hands. Yet I cannot rebuild this realm without you." She observed their reactions. Some nodded grudgingly, others kept silent. "I call upon each of you to declare your support for a united kingdom," she continued. "I will see your lands restored, your people fed, your rights respected. The realm has endured too many tyrants. Let us forge a true peace, not with fear, but with justice." Lord Royce, a large man with a brusque manner, stepped forward. "Your Grace," he began, "the Vale remembers the Targaryens' might of old. We have seen what your dragons can do. We pledge to support you, so long as you keep true to your word, to preserve our lands and respect our traditions." Daenerys inclined her head. "The Vale shall have its rights and freedoms, and I shall uphold them as fiercely as I would my own claim to the throne." A few more voices spoke up, echoing a tenuous acceptance. There was cautious relief, perhaps, that the city had fallen swiftly, that the war might truly be at an end. Yet Daenerys sensed an unspoken question lingering like the scent of smoke. Would the Dragon Queen truly be better than her predecessors? Then a new voice spoke, that of the Stormlands representative. "Your Grace, We've heard rumors of unrest among your dragons themselves. Some have said they circle the skies at night, roaring. Others have claimed to see them near the roads, unsettling travelers. The question was couched delicately, but the implication was clear. If her dragons were not under her control, how safe was her reign? Daenerys's fingers tightened around the pommel of the sword she carried at her side. She forced a calm expression. The dragons are my children. They hunt for food, just as any predator might. They will not harm those who do not threaten them. I ask that you treat them with the respect they are owed, and with caution. She paused, scanning the faces before her. I alone command them. That has not changed. Still, she could hear the doubt rippling through the hall. A queen who was one with dragons, so long as the dragons were united with her. But what if they weren't? She needed to quell that doubt before it took root. She drew herself up. As a gesture of my goodwill and the new peace, I shall ensure that supply lines from the Crownlands replenish the Stormlands, the Reach and the Vale. Lord Royce, have your men arrange caravans for safe passage. Food, seed, and building materials will be shared, so that we may rebuild as one. Some of the lords exchanged glances, possibly surprised at her generosity. Daenerys pressed on. I do this not for advantage, but because my dream has always been to protect the common folk. I fought to free slaves across the sea, and I will fight to free you all from famine and ruin. Her words rang with conviction, and she noticed slight nods around the battered throne room. It wasn't fervent acceptance, but it was a start. She brought the meeting to a close, promising more discourse. Science to finalize the details. As the lords departed, Missandei approached with a respectful bow of her head. Your Grace, the dragons are circling outside the city again. It seems Rhaegal has returned. Daenerys felt her pulse quicken, an anxious flutter. She excused herself from the great hall, stepping outside into the courtyard that overlooked the main gate. There, the sky was alive with movement. Drogon soared at a lower altitude, while Rhaegal circled wide, occasionally letting out a throaty hiss. Viserion was perched on a half-collapsed tower, watchful. The tension between them had not dissipated with the coming of day. She saw Rhaegal swoop, a talon extended as if to snatch something from the ground, perhaps a stray animal or a chunk of meat. The watchers on the walls cowered. Daenerys clenched her teeth, determined that the city's defenders not panic. Grey Worm, she commanded sharply. Order the men to stay their arrows. No one is to attack unless the dragons truly pose a threat. Grey Worm gave a curt nod. He trusted her to keep the beasts in check, but Daenerys could see the concern etched on his face. If the dragons chose violence, few arrows would avail them. She drew a deep breath and moved to Mount Drogon. She had done so hundreds of times, but always with a sense of reverence for his immense power. As she climbed onto his back, the black scales felt hot beneath her touch. Drogon rumbled, his chest vibrating. She secured her hold, pressing a hand against his neck, murmuring soothingly. The wind whipped her hair as Drogon launched himself upward, mighty wings pumping. The courtyard shrank below her, soldiers scattering like ants. She signaled Drogon to fly near Rhaegal. The green bronze dragon roared, then soared higher as if he wanted to keep his distance. Daenerys guided Drogon to follow, calling out Rhaegal's name. She could feel the anger or restlessness radiating from Rhaegal, sensed the deep chord of frustration in the bond they shared. She suspected that Rhaegal felt overshadowed, or perhaps threatened by Drogon's alpha dominance, and something in him had grown rebellious. It wasn't as though he hated Drogon, but rather that he yearned for an equal share of Daenerys's attention. She cast a brief glance to the tower where Viserion perched. She sensed the pale dragon's watchful gaze. He too seemed torn. Up they soared, the battered city diminishing below. The wind howled past Daenerys's ears. She tried not to recall the last time she had soared above a city in conquest. That day had ended in too many flames for her liking. This time, she needed to quell the fire before it spread. She coaxed Drogon to edge closer to Rhaegal's flank. She extended a hand, though it was a futile gesture at such speeds. Rhaegal turned his great head, glared at Drogon, and exhaled a short burst of flame in the open air. Not an attack, but a warning. Drogon answered with a roar of his own, flaring his wings. Daenerys's heart pounded. The wind tore at her, and the tension between the dragons crackled like lightning. "No," she whispered in High Valyrian, though she wasn't sure if they could hear her over the raging wind. "Peace. My children, we must have peace." She clenched her thighs against Drogon's scales, urging him not to fight, to show calm. She stroked his neck and thought of the many times she had soothed him when he was younger and wild. Now he was enormous, an apex predator above all other creatures in the sky. But he recognized her voice, her touch. Slowly, Drogon reined in his aggression, though his rumbling chest spoke of his displeasure. Rhaegal, seeing Drogon's cessation, snorted and flew a short distance away, as if claiming his own portion of the skies. Daenerys guided Drogon to hover near him, letting them share the domain without overshadowing each other. After many tense moments, Rhaegal folded his wings to descend, and Daenerys took that as a sign to do the same with Drogon. Viserion took flight from his perch, following suit. From above, the city's ruin was more evident. Scorched rooftops, collapsed towers, the black scars of dragonfire. Daenerys swallowed the lump in her throat. This realm needed healing, and she had no time to preside over rebellious dragons. They landed in the outer courtyard. Rhaegal flapped to the far side, while Viserion dropped behind a charred stable. Drogon roared in warning, but did not strike. Daenerys slid off Drogon's back, her knees trembling from the tension of the ride. Grey Worm and Missandei hurried forward, while soldiers kept a wide perimeter. Daenerys raised a hand. "Do not approach," she ordered them. "Let me try to speak with them." She called Rhaegal's name, but the green dragon only watched her from a distance, eyes narrowed. Viserion let out a mournful cry. She sensed they were unsettled, as if the skies themselves were not big enough for 3 adult dragons of such might. The old stories never spoke of how the Targaryens dealt with multiple dragons once they reached maturity. The family's ancient practice might have entailed separate lairs, or something else entirely. But Daenerys had no manuals for this. She would have to trust her instincts. For the next several days, the tension continued. Daenerys spent hours each sunrise and sunset tending the dragons, feeding them, flying with Drogon, coaxing Rhaegal and Viserion to join in hunts away from the city. Sometimes they followed her calls. Sometimes they soared off in solitary arcs. The soldiers and small folk watched with awe or dread, never sure if the flicker of dragon wings meant salvation or destruction. Meanwhile, Daenerys struggled to manage the affairs of state, negotiating with wary lords, easing resentments among the common folk, and organizing supply chains. She had Missandei at her side, quiet and steadfast, but she ached for the presence of Ser Jorah, who had died in her arms at the Battle of Winterfell. She wondered if Tyrion, had he survived, would have found the words to quell the realm's anxieties or offered cunning solutions to quell the dragon's disquiet. But she had lost Tyrion to the chaos of the final siege. Now she ruled with only a small circle of trusted advisors: Grey Worm, Missandei, a handful of lesser knights and freedmen, and the unwavering presence of her dragons. But that very presence was now a source of strife. One late afternoon, as she walked among the rubble-strewn streets, speaking with a small cluster of laborers trying to clear debris, she heard the distant roar of dragons. This was not uncommon, yet there was something sharper in the roar. She turned sharply, ignoring the dust swirling around her feet. She felt a jolt in her heart, a primal warning that something had gone awry. Grey Worm was at her side in an instant, spear in hand. "Your Grace?" he asked, concern edging his voice. She held up a hand for silence, straining her ears. Another roar, this time deeper, more ferocious, Drogon's, and it was followed by a shriek that she recognized as Viserion's. "They're fighting," Daenerys whispered, dread clenching her gut. Without another word, she ran for the nearest gate that led out of the city. She emerged into the open fields, ignoring the startled stares of soldiers. Overhead, clouds had gathered in a swirl of gray, a prelude to a coming storm. In that darkening sky, she saw three silhouettes, twisting and turning in ominous shapes. Drogon was locked in a spiraling confrontation with Viserion, jaws snapping, as Rhaegal circled with agitated roars. Flames spewed from Drogon's maw, narrowly missing Viserion, who dodged with a swift roll. Rhaegal roared at both, as if trying to intervene. Daenerys's blood ran cold. She sprinted across the field, calling their names with all her might, but she was drowned out by the thunder of beating wings. She stood there, helpless, uncertain how to break their battle without risking them turning their wrath upon each other, or her. Soldiers gathered, some raising crossbows in panic. "No!" Daenerys screamed, voice cracking. "Lower your weapons. Do not shoot." She saw Grey Worm barking orders, driving the men back. Then Viserion unleashed a torrent of flame that grazed Drogon's flank. Drogon bellowed in pain and fury, beating his wings to gain altitude. Rhaegal streaked toward them, slamming into Viserion's side to stop the assault. The three dragons tumbled in the air, a chaotic knot of wings and talons. Daenerys's heart felt like it might burst. She could see flecks of blood swirling in the sky. This was not some harmless scuffle. They could maim or kill each other. Desperate, she ran toward Drogon's vantage point, though he was high above, trying to disentangle from the dogfight. She called to him in a voice that threatened to shatter her throat. She thought of the day she had proven her control, unscathed by their flames, forging a bond that had seemed unbreakable. But now they were older, wilder, emboldened by their own instincts. Finally, Drogon twisted away from Viserion, diving downward. Viserion tried to pursue, but Rhaegal cut him off, forcing Viserion to veer aside with a frustrated snarl. Daenerys seized the moment. She clambered onto a piece of shattered masonry, arms stretched high, calling Drogon's name as thunder boomed in the distance. The black dragon swept low, knocking her back with the gust of his wings. But she latched onto the protruding spines along his flank, hoisting herself onto his back, heart hammering. She felt Drogon's pain through their bond. Viserion's fire had singed the edge of his scales, leaving a smoldering patch. But he was still strong, still furious. Daenerys pressed herself close to his neck, urging him to calm, to heed her call. With a mighty push, Drogon rose back into the sky, and Daenerys held on, wind tearing at her face. She leaned forward, meeting Rhaegal's gaze as they crossed paths. She beckoned Rhaegal to join them in retreat, to let Viserion calm. Rhaegal roared at Viserion, spitting a small burst of flame to warn him off. Viserion hissed, though Daenerys sensed he was more startled than truly murderous. "I will not lose any of you." In the days that followed, Daenerys and her small council devised a plan. The city still needed to be rebuilt, but the dragons could not roam so freely in such close proximity if they were going to challenge each other at every turn. The old Targaryens had used the Dragon Pit, an immense dome structure atop a hill in King's Landing meant for housing dragons. But that structure was largely destroyed, and even if it were intact, Daenerys doubted it could easily contain 3 adult dragons of such size without inciting fury. Instead, she resolved to move Rhaegal and Viserion farther away from the heart of the city, establishing separate lairs in the outlying countryside, with a rotation that would bring them into King's Landing at different times. Perhaps if they did not have to crowd each other, their tempers might cool. She hated the thought of keeping them apart, but she saw no alternative. She enlisted the Dothraki to clear areas of farmland that had been abandoned, creating wide open spaces for the dragons to hunt. The Unsullied, unwavering in discipline, helped to build stone barriers and watchtowers, not to confine the dragons, but to keep panicked people from wandering into their territory unawares. Daenerys spent time each day with each dragon, tending injuries from the fight, offering the soothing presence of her voice and touch. Drogon bore his burn with pride, as if defying Viserion's attempt to best him. Rhaegal seemed restless, caught between loyalty to Daenerys and a simmering rivalry with Drogon. Viserion's wing healed slowly, and with that came more agitation. He had always been swift in flight, and being grounded for any length of time seemed to rankle him. Only Daenerys could approach him closely, administering salves to the membrane while murmuring half-remembered lullabies in High Valyrian. All the while, Daenerys's heart ached with the question, why did they now seem so eager to challenge one another? Was it simply nature, dragons grown to adulthood, each seeking dominance? Or had her own recent turmoil, her own anguish in war, affected the bond she shared with them, opening cracks that gave rise to conflict? She could not dismiss the guilt gnawing at her, that perhaps her thirst for conquest, her burning rage at those who had betrayed her, had put flames in her dragons' hearts too. Dragons were magic, but they were also mirrors, reflecting the souls of those who rode them. The daily tasks of queenship weighed heavily, receiving supplicants who begged for aid, signing decrees, organizing shipments of grain from the riverlands to the starving in the city, dealing with the aftermath of the Lannister regime. Daenerys found herself exhausted each night, physically and emotionally. Missandei tried to comfort her, reminding her of all she had accomplished, but Daenerys felt the fracture growing in her domain. Some of the small folk muttered about the dragons that soared overhead, frightened they might be next to burn. The lords looked upon her not with love, but with wariness. In hushed corners, more than one schemer whispered that if the queen could not control her dragons, it might be time for another. After so many losses, Ser Jorah, Tyrion, the many Dothraki and Unsullied, Daenerys did not know if she had the strength to root out fresh treasons. She consoled herself with the memory of her freed slaves in Essos cheering her name, the taste of salted air as she sailed to Westeros, the vision of a united kingdom under her just rule. But that vision was now overshadowed by the reality of internal strife. Sometimes she dreamt of Rhaegal and Viserion confronting Drogon in the blackness of night, all three roaring in unholy fury, flames lighting the sky, until only the battered corpse of one remained. She would wake in a sweat, tears staining her cheeks. As the next moon cycle waxed and waned, the physical fights between the dragons did not reoccur, but the tension never relented. Rhaegal kept to the west, Viserion to the north, and Drogon roamed the city's vicinity. Daenerys visited each in turn, but rarely did they all share the same sky without sparks of hostility. When autumn's chill began to creep across the land, Daenerys resolved to try something bold. She decided to bring the dragons together again, in a controlled setting, away from the city, with a bounty of fresh game to distract them and open terrain to avoid claustrophobic confrontation. She recalled a secluded valley a few hours' ride from King's Landing, flanked by gentle hills, scattered with streams, and mostly uninhabited since the wars had decimated the region. If she could coax the dragons there and keep them well-fed, perhaps the old bond of family might reawaken. Early one morning, just after sunrise, she set out on horseback with a small retinue, Missandei, Grey Worm, and a handful of Unsullied. The air was crisp, the fields layered with morning dew. She wore furs over her riding leathers, a concession to the cooling climate. They rode first to Rhaegal's lair, an open field near a charred barn. Rhaegal greeted her with a subdued growl, blinking his great golden eyes. She stroked the side of his neck, murmuring a gentle request for him to follow. He rumbled warily but allowed her to climb atop. His scales felt colder than Drogon's, and she realized he had spent the night out in the open. With a mighty sweep of his wings, they took to the sky, the Unsullied below heading for the valley on horseback. Next, Daenerys guided Rhaegal north, where Viserion had made a makeshift roost among some rocky bluffs. The pale dragon was perched on a ledge, tail lashing. Daenerys circled overhead, calling out his name. He responded with a sharp bark of flame, as if startled, but recognized her soon enough. He took flight, gliding near them, though Daenerys could feel Rhaegal's muscles tense at the proximity. Rhaegal let out a wary growl. She used her voice to calm them both. Then, carefully, she led the way toward the valley, hoping Viserion would follow. He did, albeit at a cautious distance, scanning Rhaegal's movements as if expecting an attack. Below them, the rolling hills emerged, dotted with patches of forest, the meandering line of a stream glinting in early sunlight. Daenerys guided Rhaegal to land in a broad clearing near the stream, with enough open space for multiple dragons to spread their wings without cornering each other. Viserion landed a moment later on the opposite side. Head low, mouth parted in a slight snarl. Daenerys dismounted, her legs shaking as she surveyed the vast clearing. Grass bent under a light breeze, and the water trickled serenely. She turned to Rhaegal, pressing a hand to his flank, then faced Viserion, beckoning softly. "Come," she said, offering raw meat from a large saddlebag that Grey Worm had brought. "Eat. No one will harm you here." Viserion eyed the meat, cautious. Rhaegal growled, but Daenerys hushed him. Step by step, Viserion approached, drawn by the scent. Daenerys laid the meat on the grass and backed away. The pale dragon snapped it up, licking his jaws. Rhaegal let out a short hiss, but Daenerys fed him as well, maintaining an even distribution so neither felt slighted. The gentle strategy seemed to ease their hostility, at least enough to share the clearing without immediate violence. Then came the hardest part. She needed Drogon here. She had left him near the city, trusting he would come at her summons. She knew if she tried to retrieve him in person, she might leave Rhaegal and Viserion vulnerable to a fight if she departed. Instead, she asked Grey Worm to send 2 riders to call Drogon in the old way, with horns that Daenerys had taught them. The horns didn't command dragons, but they had learned to associate that particular signal with Daenerys' location. The riders set off at a gallop. Daenerys tried to remain calm, feeding both Rhaegal and Viserion in turns. She stroked their necks, speaking softly, praising them. The 2 dragons kept stealing. Wary glances at each other, but neither initiated aggression. Hours passed. Afternoon light slanted across the valley when Daenerys heard the distant beat of great wings. She turned to see a silhouette against the sky, blacker than night. Drogon. He descended in a swirl of wind that bent the grass and unsettled the water. The moment his talons touched the ground, he roared, a thunderous greeting that rattled Daenerys' bones. Rhaegal and Viserion answered in kind, rearing back, wings half-furled. Tension crackled in the air. Daenerys swiftly positioned herself between them, arms raised, calling out their names in a firm voice. Viserion hissed. Rhaegal growled. Drogon paced behind her, a looming shadow of muscle and scale. For a moment, Daenerys thought they might erupt into violence again. The memory of their bloody aerial fight haunted her. She held her breath, refusing to let fear rule her. She had walked into the pyre with her dragon eggs once, unafraid. She had faced the undead, faced kings and queens, faced traitors. She had to face this as well. She clenched her trembling fists and spoke in High Valyrian, the language of old Valyria, the language of dragons. She reminded them of their shared bond, how each egg had hatched in her arms, how they had soared together across the narrow sea, how they had saved one another from the spear of the Night King, from the arrows of Lannister scorpions. She called Drogon her firstborn in flame, Rhaegal her second child named for her valiant brother Rhaegar, Viserion her shining son named for Viserys, who, despite his cruelty, had once been her only kin. She pleaded with them to remember that they were one family, that though dominance might shift and instincts clash, they need not destroy each other. The dragons listened, or at least they hesitated. Then Drogon let out a deep rumble, stepping closer to Daenerys' side, overshadowing her slender form. Viserion lowered his head, body tense, flames flickering at the edges of his mouth. Rhaegal glared. She could feel the swirling emotions in them. Fury, fear, longing. It was far from certain that her words alone could mend a rift born of their primal natures. Still, she refused to falter. She drew closer to Rhaegal, gently pressing a hand to his flank, then turned and placed her other hand upon Drogon's massive claw, bridging the gap. Viserion hissed, as if feeling left out. Daenerys turned her gaze upon him, beckoning softly, trying to reassure him that there was room in her heart for all three. She waited, heart pounding. Finally, Viserion stepped forward, each movement a potential trigger for chaos. But as he neared, Daenerys saw a glimmer of the old trust in his eyes. She breathed a slow exhale. The pale dragon lowered his head so she could rest a palm upon his snout. She stood now, physically touching all three dragons at once, forming a triad of scale and flesh in the quiet valley. The tension in their bodies remained, but none lashed out. It was, Daenerys thought, the closest they had come to unity in weeks. Night came, and Daenerys and her retinue made camp near the valley's fringe, giving the dragons the main clearing. The 3 dragons circled overhead for a time, then eventually came to rest, keeping a respectful distance from each other. None too close, none fully relaxed. Grey Worm, Missandei, and Daenerys dined quietly by a small fire. She shared her fears and hopes in a low voice. Missandei listened, empathy shining in her warm eyes. Grey Worm offered a terse nod, promising to keep the watch alert for any sign of renewed hostilities among the dragons. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the sun casting long rays across the grass. Daenerys woke to the sounds of deep rumbles and roars from the clearing. Heart pounding, she scrambled from her tent to see Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion confronting each other once more. She ran breathless across the dew-soaked ground, shouting their names, ready to intervene. But as she drew near, she realized they were not fighting. They were feeding. At some point, a herd of wild elk had wandered into the valley, and the dragons had cooperated, or at least coexisted, in hunting them. Drogon sank his jaws into one elk carcass, while Rhaegal tore at another. Viserion stood over a third, occasionally snapping at Rhaegal if he came too close, but overall they seemed to be ignoring each other beyond the occasional warning growl. Daenerys exhaled a trembling breath. It wasn't a perfect harmony, but it was not the savage conflict she had feared. She watched from a distance as they devoured their prey, each dragon vigilantly guarding its kill. Afterward, they wandered to the stream to drink, the early sun glinting off their scales. Daenerys approached carefully, letting them sense her presence. Drogon rumbled as she neared, but it was a greeting rather than a challenge. She stroked his muzzle, the familiar roughness of his scales beneath her fingers. Her heart swelled with cautious hope. Rhaegal was closer than usual, finishing a drink from the stream, casting a sidelong glance at Drogon but not attacking. Viserion stood on a small rise, wings half open, as if uncertain whether to join them or claim a separate space. Daenerys turned her gaze to Viserion and smiled softly, beckoning. He descended, a ripple of muscle under his pale hide, and joined them at the water's edge. The 3 dragons stood in uneasy proximity, but they stood together nonetheless. In the following days, Daenerys strove to nurture that fragile truce. She remained in the valley, letting the burdens of the city rest on the shoulders of her council for a short while. She wrote letters by Raven, issuing instructions for distribution of supplies and the continuing reconstruction. As for the dragons, she saw them cooperate in hunts, flying in wide arcs over the hills and returning with fresh kills, their roars echoing in the crisp air. Tension lingered, especially between Drogon and Viserion, but they no longer lunged at each other with lethal intent. She suspected that the space and ample food were helping, and also the renewed time she spent with all of them equally. She made certain to mount not just Drogon but also Rhaegal, who allowed her on his back with some coaxing, and even Viserion, though his healing wing limited how far they could fly. Each time, she reaffirmed their bond, reminding them that they were a family. She sensed her own spirit healing as well, finding solace in nature's quiet away from the city's tragedies and political maneuvering. Yet Daenerys knew they could not remain in isolation forever. She had a kingdom to govern, a city to rebuild, and the people needed their queen. She resolved that the dragons must return to King's Landing, not all at once, but in a structured manner that would not incite fear or reignite their rivalries. She arranged for Drogon to remain with her at the city while Rhaegal and Viserion each had separate territories around the Crownlands, so that none felt overshadowed. She would rotate which dragon she flew each day, so none felt ignored. It was a delicate plan, relying on each dragon's tenuous acceptance of the arrangement. But she believed they were learning to coexist again. When she finally broke camp in the valley, she felt both relief and trepidation. She bid farewell to the wide meadows and the small stream, uncertain if the dragons might resent the end of their relative freedom. But as Drogon bore her into the skies, She looked back to see Rhaegal and Viserion following at a distance, their roars echoing across the morning breeze. She felt a stirring in her chest, hope. Arriving at King's Landing, she noted how the reconstruction had progressed. The main thoroughfares were cleared, rubble carted away, a semblance of normalcy returning to the battered city. When the dragons soared over the walls, there was shouting from below, but not the sheer panic of before. Daenerys' plan was already in motion. Watchers blowing horns, letting people know that the dragon's arrival was intentional, not an attack. Rhaegal peeled off to the west, toward the farmland that had been set aside for him, while Viserion circled once above the city's outskirts, then followed. Drogon landed near the Red Keep, warily scanning the battered ramparts. Daenerys dismounted, patting his side, letting him know she was proud. She turned to find Grey Worm and Missandei waiting, relief mingling with curiosity on their faces. "How did it go?" Missandei asked softly. "They have calmed," Daenerys replied. "They're not the way they were, but we are a family again." It was a fragile new beginning. Daenerys spent the next weeks juggling the demands of rebuilding and the delicate dance of dragon relations. Each day, she visited Rhaegal's territory to feed him or simply to remain present. Then she would meet Viserion on the open plains north of the city, ensuring he was healing and well-fed. She would fly Drogon around the perimeter of King's Landing, letting people see that she did not mean to unleash a reign of terror but could protect them if needed. Gradually, fear among the population gave way to guarded acceptance, then a slow, careful admiration. They saw the dragons not raining fire upon them but patrolling as watchful guardians. Daenerys instructed the Unsullied to stand down from showy force, focusing instead on aiding the small folk in clearing rubble and setting up new homes. The Dothraki, many now more interested in feasting and reaping spoils, had grown restless, but Daenerys allowed them to roam under strict orders to pillage no one. She granted them certain tracts of land where they could hunt and ride. It was a tenuous peace, but it held. Within the city, rumors spread of how the three dragons had almost destroyed each other, but the queen had healed their rift. Some whispered that it was a sign of her divine destiny, others that it was sheer luck. Some remained convinced that no mortal could truly tame dragons, and that another terrible cataclysm was inevitable. Daenerys could not quell all rumors, but she paid them little mind. She focused on forging alliances, stabilizing food supplies, and passing decrees that favored justice over vengeance. She saw to it that the orphans of war were housed, that the distribution of grain was fair, and that any who had lost limbs in the fighting received care. More than once, she quietly left the Red Keep to walk among the people at night, disguised in a cloak to hear their stories. She heard the heartbreak and anger over loved ones lost, but she also heard gratitude from those who believed in her cause. Slowly, the city breathed again. One evening, as she walked the perimeter walls at sunset, she caught sight of all three dragons in the sky, their silhouettes stark against the dying light. Drogon flew above the keep, Rhaegal soared from the west, and Viserion joined from the north. They did not clash. Instead, they circled once, letting out a trio of roars that thrummed through the air. Daenerys' heart soared with them, a tear of sheer relief sliding down her cheek. She thought back to the moment she had emerged from the funeral pyre of Khal Drogo with three infant dragons perched on her shoulders. They had been so small, so full of potential. Now they were forces of nature with wills of their own. Yet they had not forsaken her, and she had not forsaken them. They were a family bound by fire and blood, love and loyalty. She watched them disappear into the clouds, the last rays of the sun catching the tips of their wings. In that moment, she felt something akin to true peace, a sense that perhaps they could move beyond the endless cycles of war and destruction. She turned to find Missandei standing quietly behind her, hands clasped. Daenerys smiled, a rare, unguarded smile. "They're still with me," she said, voice trembling with wonder and relief. Missandei returned the smile, stepping forward to place a gentle hand on Daenerys' arm. "As long as you love them, and they love you, no force can truly break that bond." Daenerys nodded, She gazed once more at the twilight sky, where her dragons had vanished. "Let this be the beginning of a lasting peace," she whispered. "For them and for all of us." She descended the stairs of the city wall, heading back into the Red Keep. Lamps flickered in the hallways, casting dancing shadows across the ancient stones. She passed the scorched remnants of tapestries, the battered columns that once bore the banners of House Targaryen, House Lannister, House Baratheon. So much history of violence, so much blood spilled for the Iron Throne. Daenerys entered the throne room, now partially restored, though still a patchwork of broken grandeur. The Iron Throne stood at the far end, twisted swords forging its shape. She approached it, trailing a hand over the blackened metal. It had been the object of her pursuit for most of her life. Now that she held it, she understood how heavy a burden it truly was, how deep the scars of conquest ran, not just in the city, but in her very soul. She sank onto the throne, letting its cold hardness press against her back, reminding her that power was no comfort if it was not used wisely. She bowed her head, thinking of the people she had lost, the mistakes she had made, and the triumphs that had brought her here. Outside, she knew her dragon's sword, united if only precariously. She was not alone. She had Grey Worm, Missandei, the remnants of her armies, the loyal small folk who believed in her promise. She had the memories of those who had laid down their lives. And, most of all, she had her dragons, each a living piece of her heart. In that quiet moment, Daenerys thought about the future. She imagined lush fields where once there had been ash, cities filled with laughter instead of screams, people living free from the chains of tyrants. She imagined a new generation that might see dragons not as instruments of terror, but as symbols of a once mystical legacy that could protect the realm. The path ahead was long, and the outcome uncertain. There would always be lords who schemed, envoys from distant lands bearing new threats, storms both literal and metaphorical to challenge her rule. The realm would never be easy to govern, and the dragons might always harbor a streak of wild independence. But she took heart in knowing that, for now, they had chosen peace over strife. And as she sat upon the Iron Throne, Daenerys Stormborn, mother of dragons, breaker of chains, she vowed to do the same. She rose from the throne, letting the echo of her footsteps dissipate in the halls. Outside, the night sky glimmered with countless stars. Each star, she reflected, was a story yet to be told, a life yet to be touched by the realm's shifting tides. If she guided Westeros with compassion, if she nurtured the bond with her dragons through respect rather than fear, perhaps one day the realm might truly know prosperity. With that hope burning in her chest, she made her way to her chambers. In the morning, she would continue the work of rebuilding. She would greet her dragons, feed them, fly with them if the day allowed, and remind them that no matter their instincts for dominance, she would always love them equally. And they, in turn, would guard her skies, challenging each other only as siblings do, forging a fragile harmony that might just endure. The wind would carry their roars across the 7 kingdoms, a testament to the new era she strove to create. An era where the dragons lived, bound not by chains but by choice, and where a queen sought not just to conquer, but to shepherd her people into a brighter dawn. She rose early the next morning, the first light of dawn painting the sky in muted pink and gold. The Red Keep's corridors were cool, haunted by the faint echoes of an older age. Outside, on the charred stones of the yard, she found Drogon waiting. The black dragon had curled himself into a corner beneath a battered overhang that once led to a stable. He opened one gleaming eye as she approached, a low rumble in his throat that might have been a greeting or a gentle warning. Daenerys pressed a hand to his flank, feeling the slow, steady swell of his breathing under her palm. With affection, she noted that the scorch on his side, Viserion's furious nip of flame, had formed a ragged patch, but it looked clean. No new infection. Their bond allowed her a faint sense of his discomfort, but also his resilience. Drogon had always been indomitable. In a few hours, she would meet with a new wave of petitioners, small folk and minor lords who trickled into King's Landing each day, seeking her judgment or her mercy. But for a precious moment, She let the swirl of duty recede. She rested her forehead against Drogon's scales, recalling every step that had led her here. The desert wastes where she had once clutched 3 eggs in trembling hands, the green seas of Essos as she marched forth to break chains, the white expanse of the north where she had joined forces to defeat the Night King, and then back south to claim the Iron Throne. So many battles, so many sacrifices. She had not envisaged, in her earliest dreams, that Rhaegal and Viserion would test her as fiercely as any usurper. Yet her children, too, struggled under the weight of a world forever changed by war. She felt footsteps approach and turned to see Grey Worm at a respectful distance. He wore his usual unsmiling expression, but she sensed a certain softness in his eyes, concern, perhaps, or simple regard for his queen. Even as battle-hardened as he was, Grey Worm had always cared for her well-being. She faced him, drawing herself up. "Is there news?" she asked quietly, letting her hand slip from Drogon's side. Grey Worm inclined his head. "Yes, Your Grace. We've had word from the surrounding regions. Lord Royce has established caravans that will bring lumber and grain from the Vale. The harvest was modest, but it should help sustain us through the winter." He paused, inhaling, as if weighing whether to speak more. "There is also talk from the Reach. Some lesser lords are quarreling over who shall preside at Highgarden now that House Tyrell is gone." A shadow passed across Daenerys' features. The Tyrells had been powerful allies once, yet that line was extinguished. "Let them quarrel for the moment," she said. "But we must keep an eye on the Reach. That land is too fertile to be left in disarray. If the wrong sort seizes power there, it could destabilize half the realm." Grey Worm nodded, his voice low. "I understand, Your Grace. We'll remain vigilant." He shifted on his feet, as though uncertain how to proceed. She waited. At last, he added, "The soldiers remain uneasy. There is still fear about the dragons, about whether we can truly control them." Daenerys felt a pang of guilt and frustration alike. "Let them see Drogon patrolling peacefully," she said, "and have them watch for Rhaegal and Viserion at a safe distance. I want no arrows loosed unless it is a matter of life and death. The dragons are not our enemies. They are our guardians, when treated with respect." Grey Worm bowed. "As you wish, Your Grace." He turned to leave but paused. "And the petitioners gather in the throne room. They'll be ready for you soon." Daenerys nodded. She glanced at Drogon, who regarded her with an unreadable reptilian gaze. She longed to mount him and fly off for an hour or two, bridging the distance to Rhaegal or Viserion's lairs, ensuring they had not grown restless. But her responsibilities as queen beckoned. Steeling herself, she followed Grey Worm through the twisting corridors, up the grand steps that led to the throne room's entrance. Each time she passed through these halls, she noted fresh attempts at rebuilding. Stonemasons smoothing cracked blocks, carpenters reinforcing rafters. It would take years, perhaps decades, to restore King's Landing to its former splendor, but every hammer's blow was a small step toward new life. Inside, the throne room brimmed with hushed voices. Townsfolk, dressed in simple garb, stood alongside lesser knights wearing patched armor. Daenerys moved through the parted crowd, ascending the short flight of steps to stand before the Iron Throne. A hush fell. She sensed the uncertain reverence in their eyes. The breaker of chains, the mother of dragons, the conqueror who had burned a queen in her own city, and the woman who now sought to mend the realm. Daenerys was used to such silent scrutiny, yet it still weighed upon her. She drew a soft breath. "Bring forth the petitioners," she commanded. One by one they approached. A blacksmith, head bowed, spoke of needing coin to rebuild his forge. A widow pleaded for help after losing her home in the final assault. Her 4 children huddled behind her in ragged cloaks. A minor lord complained that his grain stores had been seized by roving bandits on the Rose Road. Daenerys listened to each, aware that her judgments would shape how the small folk perceived her new reign. She dispensed what aid she could. A small purse from the royal treasury for the blacksmith, a promise of shelter for the widow's family, an order for a contingent of soldiers to patrol the Rose Road. Each solution was a patch on a far larger tapestry of ruin, but it was something. She recalled how she had once tried to rule Meereen, dispensing justice in the Great Pyramid. The lessons she had learned there, about compromise, about the slow nature of progress, remained crucial. She could not wave a hand and fix all ills, but she could set a precedent that her throne was not built solely on fire and blood. In the midst of these petitions, an older man stepped forward, dressed in threadbare finery. He introduced himself as Ser Martin of House Langward, one of the lesser Crownland's houses that had once supported the Targaryens. He bowed so low Daenerys feared he might topple. "Your Grace," he croaked, voice carrying a tremor. "My lands border those where one of your dragons now roams. Rhaegal, I believe. We have seen him overhead, hunting at dawn, sometimes at dusk. My small folk are terrified, though none have been harmed." He wrung his hands together. "May I beg you to keep him far from our fields? We have only begun to plant again." Daenerys considered his request, feeling a familiar twinge of protectiveness for Rhaegal. She remembered how gently he had once nudged her with his snout as a hatchling, how valiantly he had carried her over the battlefields of the north. Yet she could not ignore the fear of these people who tilled the land. "I understand your concern," she replied, her voice measured. "Rhaegal roams freely because he must hunt. He is no lapdog that can be tied to a stake. But I will speak with him, encourage him to range farther for his hunts, and see that a portion of the western woodlands is set aside for him." Ser Martin breathed a sigh of relief, though he did not fully mask his lingering doubt. "Thank you, Your Grace. The small folk will be heartened to know their queen hears their pleas." Another petitioner stepped forward, a younger woman who introduced herself as Lady Tina Rivers, an offshoot of a noble house in the Stormlands. Her figure was tall, her bearing proud, but Daenerys noticed a hint of fear behind her eyes. "Your Grace," she said, "I have traveled from Griffin's Roost. We have no shortage of trouble there. Bandits plague the roads, and though we sought refuge under your name, we have seen little help. My father, he was loyal to you, but he has taken ill." Her voice wavered. "He begs for any sign of your protection. If you could but spare a few men." Daenerys nodded, glancing at Grey Worm. The Unsullied had been stretched thin, maintaining order in King's Landing and the outlying areas. The Dothraki roamed, more interested in open fields than garrison duty. Still, she wished to show strength, to reassure loyal houses that they were not abandoned. "I will dispatch a contingent of knights," she said carefully. "Some who have recently sworn loyalty here in the capital. They will be under my banner, with authority to pacify bandits in the Stormlands. Tell your father he has not been forgotten." Relief flickered across Lady Tina's face. She bowed deeply, voice quivering with gratitude. Daenerys motioned her aside. The line continued. She felt the slow ache of responsibility settle heavier on her shoulders with each supplicant. She glanced up once, seeing Missandei standing nearby, taking notes. Her friend offered a gentle, encouraging smile. But Daenerys knew these requests were but a fragment of the realm's needs. Even if her dragons were at peace, the Seven Kingdoms bristled with scars left by recent wars and older grievances that had never fully healed. At length, the petitions ended. Daenerys dismissed the assembly, advising them to speak further with the Master of Stores, one of the freedmen she had promoted, if they needed ration allocations. She stepped away from the throne and made her way toward the back of the hall, where Missandei awaited. Grey Worm followed at a short distance, ever vigilant. "Your Grace," Missandei said softly, "there is a messenger from the Iron Islands waiting in the corridor." Daenerys's brow arched. The Iron Islands? I had hoped they would send Yara Greyjoy herself. Yara had once pledged herself to Daenerys in exchange for independence. After the wars, Daenerys had granted her a measure of autonomy, too preoccupied with the conflict on the mainland to impose full authority. "Show the messenger in," she instructed. A moment later, a wiry man with salt-stained clothes and a wind-burned face stepped forward. He bowed clumsily. "Your Grace, I come from Lady Yara Greyjoy. She sends her respects." He cleared his throat. "She would remind you of the promise made, that the Iron Islands might rule themselves, should you ascend to the Iron Throne. She asks if that promise stands. Daenerys recalled those negotiations clearly. Yara and Theon Greyjoy had sought her alliance, had bent the knee while also asking for independence from the mainland's rule. But that was before the final war had shaken the realm. Daenerys felt the weight of her new crown. Could she maintain the loyalty of other regions if she allowed the Iron Islands to break away? And yet, she had pledged her word in that time of urgency. "Tell Lady Yara," she said after a moment's pause, "that I have not forgotten our agreement. I ask only that she refrain from raiding the coastlines of the North or the Reach, as some Ironborn have done in the past. If she abides by that, she shall have the autonomy I promised. But if I hear of new raids or cruelty done under her banner, I will respond swiftly. My dragons fly far and wide." The messenger bowed, relief warring with apprehension in his eyes. "I shall tell her, Your Grace. She will be grateful to know your word stands." Daenerys nodded, dismissing him. As he departed, she felt the complexity of her vow weigh upon her. Letting the Iron Islands remain largely independent might stir resentment among other lords, but reneging on her pledge would paint her as untrustworthy. This, she realized again, was the burden of a queen, to choose which promises could be honored, which must be softened by necessity, and which alliances might wither if neglected. She left the throne room, ascending a spiral staircase that led to a high gallery overlooking the practice grounds. There, she found a handful of unsullied drilling in the yard below. Beyond them, across a low wall, lay the scorched remains of a garden that once bloomed with roses under the Targaryen kings of old. Daenerys's gaze lifted, searching the sky on instinct. No dragons soared overhead. She wondered if Drogon had drifted off to join his brothers, or if Rhaegal and Viserion had come near the city. A quiet prickle of anxiety brushed her mind. She had grown accustomed to seeing them daily, to bridging the spaces in her schedule just to remind them of her presence. She knew she could not smother them. Dragons were meant to roam, but every absence made her uneasy, a lingering worry that some new conflict might erupt beyond her sight. Missandei joined her on the gallery. "Your Grace," she said gently, "would you like to rest? You've been holding court since daybreak." Daenerys shook her head. "I'm not tired." She paused, amending that half-truth. "I am tired, but there is no time for rest. The realm does not cease its demands. Tell me, any word from the north?" Missandei consulted a small parchment in her hands. "A raven arrived this morning from Winterfell. The Lady of Winterfell, Sansa Stark, sends guarded well wishes. She acknowledges your claim but asks for more supplies. The harvest in the north was poor, and winter's bite grows sharper." Daenerys felt an old tension stir at the mention of Sansa Stark. They had never trusted one another fully, yet she respected the North's resilience, and she remembered how fiercely the Northerners had fought against the undead threat. "Have we enough surplus to spare?" she asked. Missandei nodded. "It will be tight, but we can send a fraction of the shipments. Perhaps if the Vale's caravans keep coming, we can redirect more to the north." Daenerys exhaled. "Then do it. Send word to Lady Stark that the crown acknowledges her plight. Remind her also that we are forging a new era of cooperation." Missandei bowed. Before she could leave, Daenerys placed a hand on her arm. "Thank you," she murmured. "I do not know what I'd do without you by my side." The Nathi woman's eyes glistened. "I serve you gladly, Your Grace. You have freed me from chains, and I will not forsake you." Daenerys let her hand slip away, a faint smile curving her lips. In a realm fractured by suspicion, Missandei's simple loyalty felt like a guiding lamp in the darkness. Eventually, Daenerys did retreat to her chambers for a brief respite. She took a midday meal of bread, goat cheese, and watered wine, luxuries to some, but modest compared to the feasts once held in these halls. She sat near the window, its frame still blackened from dragonfire. The fresh air carried a hint of salt from Blackwater Bay, mingling with the dusty scent of ancient stone. She closed her eyes, savoring a moment's quiet. In that lull, her thoughts drifted to the dragons again. Where might they be now? Drogon often circled near the city, but Rhaegal and Viserion had more expansive ranges. Perhaps they were gliding above the crownlands, or sunning themselves on a rocky outcrop. Perhaps Rhaegal had found a quiet lake, or Viserion might be perched on a high promontory, scanning the horizon for prey. The image came unbidden. The three of them as hatchlings, curled about her feet, squeaking with hunger. So small they had been, and now so powerful. She could still feel the tension coiled beneath their scales at times, the possibility that their primal instincts might again clash. But they were calmer since her efforts in the valley. She clung to that glimmer of hope. Her rest was cut short by a distant commotion. She heard raised voices in the corridor, followed by an urgent knock on her chamber door. Daenerys rose, smoothing her skirts. "Enter," she called. One of her guards opened the door, admitting a breathless messenger, a boy no older than 12. He bowed, hair tousled. "Your Grace." The dragons. The Watchers saw them in the sky. They seemed agitated. Daenerys's heart lurched. "Which dragons?" "All three," the boy said, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. They were circling above the western road. Some travelers came racing into the gates, saying the dragons roared at them. Daenerys took a steadying breath. "Were any harmed?" The boy shook his head. "No injuries reported, Your Grace, but they seemed close to fighting." Daenerys's pulse quickened. She had to act quickly, lest the tension spiral. "Alert Grey Worm," she ordered. "Gather a small escort. I will go to them at once." A short while later, Daenerys emerged from the Red Keep astride Drogon, who had landed in the courtyard at her summons. Missandei and Grey Worm stood by, watching with concern. The black dragon shifted restlessly, as though sensing the distant agitation of his siblings. Daenerys felt a flicker of apprehension but steadied herself. "Find me at the western road," she told Grey Worm. "Bring no more than 10 soldiers, well disciplined. I want no accidents." Grey Worm saluted, and Daenerys urged Drogon skyward. The city shrank beneath her as they ascended into swirling winds. She searched the horizon, seeking any sign of Rhaegal and Viserion. Dark clouds loomed to the west, hinting at an approaching storm. She guided Drogon toward that gathering gloom. When she finally saw them, her heart pounded. Rhaegal and Viserion circled in wide arcs over a stretch of road where travelers huddled near a copse of trees, their wagons abandoned in terror. Rhaegal let out a roar that reverberated through Daenerys's bones, while Viserion hissed in response, wings beating anxiously. She urged Drogon closer, calling out in High Valyrian. At the sound of her voice, Rhaegal glanced downward, tail lashing. Viserion twisted midair, loosing a burst of flame into the sky. No target, just a show of agitation. Daenerys grit her teeth. She could sense their heightened emotions, a pulse of fear, anger, or confusion. Often, dragons responded to perceived threats with displays of dominance. Perhaps the presence of travelers or wagons had startled them. The road was not far from Rhaegal's territory, and Viserion might have wandered over from his own domain. If each dragon believed the road was part of his territory, conflict would brew. Drogon roared, and Daenerys felt the vibration ripple up her spine. She stroked his neck, urging calm. "Easy," she murmured, though the wind tore the words from her lips. She guided Drogon into the space between Rhaegal and Viserion, hoping to separate them if needed. She saw Grey Worm and his men arrive below, though they kept their distance. The travelers on the ground cried out, cowering under a crude wooden cart. Rhaegal spiraled lower, jaws parted in a growl. His tail cut through the air like a whip. Daenerys commanded Drogon to descend as well, landing upon a flat stretch of grass beside the road. Dust and leaves swirled around them. She slid off his back, legs trembling from the exertion and the tension. She raised her hands high, calling to Rhaegal and Viserion with that gentle, insistent tone she had honed. Rhaegal backwinged, his claws tearing at the air, and set down with a heavy thud on the far side of the road. Viserion followed, hissing as he saw Rhaegal claim that patch of earth. Their green and pale forms bristled at each other, eyes narrowed, wings partially spread in challenge. Daenerys moved into the open space between them before they could lunge. The watchers on the ground must have thought her mad. This slender queen stepping into the path of two towering beasts. But Daenerys had faced them from the day they hatched. She spoke in High Valyrian, firm yet coaxing, reminding them of the hunts they had shared, the enemies they had defeated. She invoked memories of the valley where they had fed side by side. She prayed it was enough to defuse their aggression. Viserion snorted, releasing a trickle of flame that fizzled on the wet grass. Rhaegal growled, smoke curling from his nostrils. Daenerys kept her gaze on both, arms raised like a supplicant. Slowly, Rhaegal lowered his head, a wary acceptance. Viserion let out a chuff, turning his gaze away. The moment passed, tension easing from the air. They had not fought. Relief coursed through Daenerys, so intense her knees nearly buckled. She could see the travelers peering out from behind their cart, astonished to have survived. Daenerys turned, beckoning them forth. A pair of trembling men emerged, followed by a woman who clutched a small child. "You're safe now," Daenerys called. "They will not harm you." The woman's eyes were like saucers, but she managed a shaky bow. "Titch, thank you, your grace." Daenerys instructed them to gather their belongings and proceed to the city gates, where her soldiers would see them fed and housed for the night. Grateful, they hurried away, casting wide-eyed glances at the dragons. Meanwhile, Grey Worm and his men formed a cautious perimeter, crossbows lowered but at the ready. Daenerys gestured for them to stand down. "There will be no fight today," she said. She could almost hear the unspoken thought in their minds. Perhaps not today, but what of tomorrow? She took some time to soothe Viserion, stroking his pale flank, murmuring as she inspected his wing. The old wound was mostly healed, just a faint ridge of scar tissue. Rhaegal watched from a short distance, no longer bristling, but neither docile. Daenerys divided what rations of fresh meat Grey Worm's men had brought, tossing chunks to each dragon. They snapped them up, shreds of sinew dangling from their jaws, a primal sort of peace offering. As the skies darkened with looming clouds, she decided to guide them back to the city walls. She could not keep them penned, but she knew that if they parted on better terms, it might reduce the chance of their next encounter turning violent. Mounting Drogon once more, she took flight, letting Rhaegal and Viserion see her leading the way. They followed, gliding in her wake, occasionally trading a hiss or a rumble. Yet they did not clash. She counted that as a victory. By the time they reached the city, distant thunder rumbled. Wind tugged at Daenerys' cloak as she alighted near the great yard outside the walls. Rhaegal and Viserion swept overhead, each choosing separate spots to land. Daenerys slid off Drogon, heart pounding from the exertion of balancing their fragile truce. Grey Worm and the soldiers arrived behind her. She instructed them to remain calm, no raised weapons. The last thing she wanted was for an arrow to spark a dragon's wrath. Slowly, she approached Rhaegal and laid a hand on his shoulder. The green dragon regarded her with an unreadable expression, then nudged her gently, as if to say he was tired of all this fuss. She moved toward Viserion, offering him the same reassurance. He growled low in his throat, but allowed her touch. Nearby, Drogon watched, tail lashing idly. The sky let loose a drizzle, raindrops spattering against charred stones. Thunder boomed again, echoing through the half-ruined battlements. Daenerys, drenched to the skin, felt a surge of defiance. The dragons were united under her voice, if only tenuously. Let the storm come, they would weather it together. Over the following weeks, she maintained a rigorous schedule of visits, dividing her time among the three dragons. She took counsel from the few maesters who had survived the wars, gleaning what bits of ancient knowledge they had about Targaryen dragons. Scant scraps, really old accounts of how King Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne had encouraged their dragons to build separate lairs, how they had minimized fights by ensuring an abundance of game, how they had used the dragon pit for gatherings. It was far from a perfect guide, but it gave Daenerys some direction. She arranged hunts well beyond the city, instructing the Dothraki to flush out wild herds so that Rhaegal and Viserion would not feel compelled to prowl the roads. She granted Drogon a roost near the Red Keep, ensuring that he would remain close by. She used every tool at her disposal: food, personal attention, her voice and presence, to reinforce that these three dragons were siblings, not rivals to be fought until the death. Yet underlying her attempts at peace was an awareness of how dragons had ultimately spelled the downfall of her ancestors. Their power had once welded the realm together, but over time, it had also sown fear, resentment, and, finally, tragedy. Daenerys felt the weight of that legacy. She did not desire a realm cowering beneath fire and wing. She wanted a realm that embraced the dragons as guardians and wonders. But trust was slow to build and easy to shatter. She heard rumors of grumblings among certain lords who whispered that the realm might be safer if the dragons were locked away or killed. That notion filled Daenerys with both fury and dread. She refused to let her children become prisoners, nor would she see them destroyed because of old hatreds. She vowed to find a better path. Meanwhile, she governed as best she could, forging alliances with new lords who came to the capital, negotiating trade with Bravos and Pentos to secure needed funds. She heard from Yara Greyjoy that a new threat had emerged from pirates harassing the shipping lanes. So Daenerys arranged for a small royal fleet to patrol the narrow sea, hoping to thwart any reavers who might sabotage her fragile economy. She also received cautious letters from Dorne, where various minor houses contested the empty seat of prince. Ever since Illyria Sand's downfall, Dorne had drifted into uncertainty. Daenerys considered traveling there, but the realm's finances and the city's reconstruction demanded her focus. In time, she told Missandei, we will bring stability to Dorne too, but one step at a time. Her greatest solace remained in those moments when she soared with her dragons in the open sky, feeling the wind whip her hair as the land unfurled below. Sometimes, she took Drogon alone. Other times, she coaxed Rhaegal or Viserion to let her ride. She felt their distinct personalities in every tilt of their wings, every thunderous beat. Drogon was bold, aggressive, diving sharply through clouds. Rhaegal's movements were more measured, as though he weighed each shift in the wind. Viserion was quick and nimble, once fully healed, spinning through the air with surprising grace. She cherished these flights, each a renewal of the bond that had begun on that pyre so long ago. She hoped, with every flight, that this unity would strengthen, carrying them beyond the strife that had threatened to tear them apart. But strife is a cunning creature, forever waiting in the shadows. One crisp morning, as Daenerys convened with her council in a half-repaired chamber of the Red Keep, the conversation turned to the rebellious undercurrents in the Reach. Reports indicated that a band of landed knights, once loyal to the Tyrells, had begun amassing arms, dissatisfied with the uncertain governance left behind. They style themselves as the Golden Harvest, spoke one of the freedmen advisors, a former scribe from Meereen who had proven adept at gathering intelligence. They claim the Queen in King's Landing is a tyrant who burned thousands. They vow to expel her from the Reach. Daenerys felt the sting of old wounds. She knew she had burned more than soldiers, that innocent lives had been lost in the chaos. Each time that memory haunted her, she resolved to move forward by doing better. But for these rebellious knights, perhaps hatred and fear outstripped reason. Grey Worm suggested sending a legion of Unsullied to quell them. They must not be allowed to fester, he said bluntly. They'll only grow bolder. Daenerys was inclined to agree, but Missandei advised caution. The realm still recovers, Your Grace. A swift march of troops might inflame more lords to join the rebels. Perhaps we should send an envoy, attempt negotiation. Daenerys weighed the possibilities. Diplomacy first, then force if necessary. She did not desire to drench the land in more blood, nor did she want the realm to see her as a queen who snuffed out dissent with dragonfire at every turn. Very well, she said. We shall send an envoy to treat with these knights. Inform them that the crown recognizes their concerns about the future of the Reach. If they lay down their arms, we will meet to discuss the region's governance. But make it clear, If they choose violence, they will face the might of the Iron Throne. Her envoy departed, bearing letters with the royal seal. Daenerys returned her attention to the city's restoration efforts. Days passed without incident, no immediate clash with the Golden Harvest. She tried to breathe easier, focusing on the tasks at hand, while still ensuring her dragons were well-fed and separated when tensions ran high. Yet a week later, a wounded messenger staggered into King's Landing by horse, blood staining his surcoat. He claimed to be the lone survivor of an ambush near Bitterbridge, where a small unit of her envoys had been attacked. The Golden Harvest had rejected the Queen's offer, declaring her a usurper. They had executed her diplomats. The messenger barely escaped with his life. Rage burned in Daenerys's veins as she listened to his tale. The realm would not stabilize if every rebel with a grievance took up arms. She summoned Grey Worm Missandei and her other advisors. "We shall not allow this barbarity to go unanswered," she said, voice trembling with fury. "Ready the Unsullied. Gather what knights we can spare. We march for the Reach. I will put an end to these fanatics." Missandei's eyes were full of concern. "Your Grace, do you mean to go personally?" Daenerys nodded firmly. "I will not hide behind these walls when rebellion stirs. I have learned from the past, fear alone is not enough. But if they think me weak, they will only grow bolder. I must show the realm that I am queen in truth, not just in name." Grey Worm inclined his head, respect in his gaze. "We march at your word, your grace." Thus began the preparations for Daenerys's first campaign to quell unrest since taking the throne. The city bustled with activity, Unsullied polishing their spears, knights donning half-mended plate, wagons laden with supplies rolling out from the gates. Daenerys directed a message to Yara Greyjoy, requesting she patrol the Mander's Mouth with a few longships, cutting off any attempt by the rebels to flee by river. The Dothraki, thirsting for action, prepared their horses. Daenerys appointed Missandei as her regent in the capital, trusting her to maintain order and continue reconstruction efforts while she was gone. A hush of worry clung to the city. The queen who had once come as a conqueror now rode out again, but this time to quell a rebellion in a shattered realm. She did not intend to bring all three dragons. That could sow chaos if they turned on one another amid a battlefield. Instead, she decided Drogon alone would fly with her, as he was the largest and most responsive to her commands in war. Rhaegal and Viserion would remain in the Crownlands. She spent the evening before her departure visiting each of them, ensuring they had ample game, leaving instructions with the Dothraki to keep watch for any signs of disquiet. The separation tugged at her heart, but she believed it necessary. She did not want to risk Rhaegal or Viserion reigniting their rivalry without her direct oversight. Clad in light armor, astride a black mare, Daenerys led her column out of King's Landing at dawn. Grey Worm marched at the head of the Unsullied, their discipline unbroken by the trials they had endured. Behind them rode a mix of knights and Dothraki, an uneasy blend of Westerosi chivalry and fierce horse lords. Overhead, Drogon soared, a living banner proclaiming Daenerys' presence. Farmers and townsfolk along the road gaped, some bowing, others fleeing indoors until the column passed. Memories of recent wars lingered in every fearful glance. The journey southward took nearly a week. Each night, Daenerys camped amid her troops, reviewing maps of the Reach. Once it had been the Tyrell's fertile domain with Highgarden as its jewel. Now it was leaderless, scattered with petty lords jockeying for advantage. The Golden Harvest had carved out a base somewhere near Bitterbridge, or so her scouts said. Rumors claimed they aimed to gather more disaffected knights and small folk to their cause, promising them a free reach unburdened by the Targaryen queen who had burned King's Landing. Daenerys seethed at the distortion of her intentions. She had sought to liberate Westeros from tyranny, only to be named tyrant by those who feared her dragons. On the sixth day, scouts reported the rebels were camped by a shallow ford of the Mander, flying a banner depicting a golden sheaf of wheat on a field of green. They numbered perhaps 1,000, including mounted knights and foot soldiers. Daenerys' forces were roughly equal, though she had Drogon as her greatest advantage. Still, She recalled the folly of relying solely on dragonfire. Burning entire armies might only cement the realm's terror. Could she subdue them without repeating the horror that had scarred King's Landing? She called a war council that evening beneath a broad oak tree. Grey Worm stood in silent readiness, while a smattering of knights eyed the Dothraki with wary respect. "We will attempt parley one final time," Daenerys said, scanning their faces. "If the Golden Harvest insists on defiance, then we must fight. But we shall not slaughter them. We shall break their lines and capture their leaders if possible." One of the knights, a burly man named Ser Giles, shifted uncomfortably. "Your Grace, these rebels executed your envoys. They refuse your rule. Are you certain we shouldn't?" "I am certain," Daenerys cut in, voice firm. "We end this rebellion without turning the fields to ash if we can. We need the Reach's harvests, and we need these knights to see that I am not a butcher." Ser Giles bowed his head, though Daenerys noted some doubt in his eyes. The next morning, dawn broke over a low mist that clung to the fields along the Mander's banks. Daenerys's host advanced cautiously, halting just out of arrow range from the rebel camp. Drogon soared overhead, roaring a challenge that echoed for miles. She watched as the Golden Harvest scrambled into defensive positions, brandishing spears and swords, their banner rippling in the breeze. Daenerys dismounted, accompanied by Grey Worm and 2 knights bearing her own banner, the 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen. She walked forward a short distance, arms raised to show she carried no weapon in hand. The tension was palpable. She saw the rebel lines waver. Then, from among them, a small party rode forth. Knights in mismatched armor, led by a tall figure with sandy hair and a grim mouth. He halted within 50 paces of Daenerys, flanked by men with crossbows. "Queen Daenerys," he called, voice carrying across the quiet field. "You come to parley at last." Daenerys studied him, chin lifted. "I came before in peace. My envoys were cut down." The man gave a dismissive snort. "They were spies, coming to sow fear. We will not bow to a queen who burned the city and claims dominion over all. The Reach will rule itself, by right of honest men who till the land and protect it." Murmurs of agreement carried from the rebel ranks. Daenerys felt the old anger rise, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You fight for illusions," she said, voice projecting. "I am no tyrant. I stand for the people of this realm, to ensure peace and prosperity." A bitter laugh escaped the tall man. "Peace through dragonfire? We have heard your promises, Targaryen. We choose freedom." He glared at her. "Leave the Reach, or we will drive you out in blood." Daenerys set her jaw. She glanced at his crossbowmen, knuckles white on their triggers. If one bolt flew, chaos would erupt. Drogon circled overhead, roaring again. "I offer you one last chance," she said. "Yield. Lay down your arms. I will grant mercy to those who bend the knee. The land needs its people alive, not slain on a battlefield." The man bared his teeth in a mocking smile. "Mercy? From the Dragon Queen? Save it. We will never kneel." He raised a hand. An arrow whistled through the air, narrowly missing Daenerys. Grey Worm and the knights surged forward. Chaos erupted. The rebels charged, crossbows twanging, spears thrusting. Daenerys whirled, grateful for Grey Worm's swift reflexes as he deflected a bolt with his shield. She retreated behind her lines, calling for the attack. The Unsullied advanced with lethal precision, locking shields in a disciplined wall. The Dothraki thundered around the flanks, howling war cries. Daenerys mounted her horse, heart pounding, and signaled to Drogon. The black dragon dove, flames spilling from his jaws. But Daenerys reined him in, guiding him to release only a small, targeted blast at the rebel vanguard. Fire engulfed a patch of ground, scattering knights. Terrified horses reared, unseating riders. The smell of smoke and singed flesh tainted the morning air. But Daenerys refused to let the conflagration spread. She pressed the attack, urging her foot soldiers to flank and surround rather than burn everything. The clash was brutal. Steel met steel, men cried out in pain, and the Mander's waters ran red in places. Grey Worm led the Unsullied in a disciplined push, capturing clusters of rebels who threw down their weapons. Others fought to the death, spitting curses at the Dragon Queen. The tall leader tried to rally his men, but the presence of Drogon overhead shattered their nerve. He swung a mace at an approaching Dothraki rider, only to be knocked from his horse by a spear thrust. Nearby, Daenerys watched with grim resolve. She offered mercy each time rebels dropped their weapons, but some refused, forcing her men to strike them down. The Golden Harvest ranks crumbled. Within an hour, the field was theirs. Smoke rose from small pockets of flame where Drogon's breath had ignited the grass. Bodies lay scattered among the churned earth. Daenerys dismounted, approaching Grey Worm and a knot of Unsullied who surrounded the tall rebel leader, wounded but alive. He knelt in the mud, clutching a bleeding arm, glaring at her with undiluted hatred. Daenerys surveyed the battlefield. Dozens of prisoners knelt, trembling. The stench of death and scorched flesh hung thick. She felt ill, remembering the charred ruins of King's Landing, the agony wrought by dragonfire. Yet this time she had used Drogon carefully, as a threat and a tool to break their charge, not a weapon of indiscriminate slaughter. "You brought this upon yourselves," she said to the tall leader, her voice heavy. "I offered peace." He spat blood. "You offered chains. Better to die free." Daenerys's jaw tightened. "You are not free, nor are you dead." She turned to Grey Worm. "Have him bound. We will bring him to Highgarden, what remains of it, and see him answer for the deaths he caused." She swept her gaze over the other prisoners. "Those who yield shall be spared. Those who continue to defy the Iron Throne will face justice." A murmur rippled through the captive rebels. Some stared at the ground, despair etched in their faces. Others glared at her with smoldering resentment, but none rose to attack. The battle was done. Drogon landed nearby, his massive form casting a long shadow over the carnage. He sniffed at a fallen horse, then turned his reptilian gaze toward Daenerys. She stepped forward, pressing a hand to his warm scales. The tremor of his breath vibrated through her palm. The men behind her fell silent, awed or terrified by the sight. In that moment, Daenerys felt the swirl of triumph and regret. The rebellion was quelled. The realm's stability was one step closer. But the cost in lives was never small. She had not come to Westeros to spill more blood, yet how many had died since her arrival? Still, she could not allow warlords to carve the realm apart. She had to act. Gently, she murmured to Drogon, coaxing him away from the scattered bodies, guiding him to a quieter spot where she could tend to any injuries. He was unhurt but for a few dents in his scales where spears had struck. In the aftermath, Daenerys ordered the prisoners marched to the nearest stronghold, an old Tyrell outpost that still had intact dungeons. She left a small garrison to ensure the rebellion did not rekindle. Then she rode on to Highgarden itself, accompanied by Grey Worm and the main host. Highgarden's gates stood rusted, the castle deserted except for a few caretakers. The grand halls, once filled with music and flowers, lay dusty and forlorn. Daenerys walked through corridors lined with faded Tyrell tapestries, feeling the echoes of a bygone era. She had never met Mace Tyrell, the lord who once hosted lavish feasts and boasted of the Reach's bounty, but she had known his daughter Marjorie, briefly, in passing. That line was extinguished now. All that remained was an empty seat at the table of power, and discontent that festered around it. Daenerys held court in the great hall of Highgarden for a brief time, listening to local peasants who came in fear of renewed warfare. She assured them the rebellion was quashed, that the fields and vineyards of the Reach would be protected under her reign. Some knelt willingly, others with stoic acceptance. She could sense the longing for stable leadership, someone to rebuild the castle, to oversee trade along the Mander, to ensure the harvests reached all corners of the realm. She needed a loyal warden here, someone with ties to the Reach who would quell future unrest without brutal oppression. The old Targaryen kings had once appointed stewards in each major region. Perhaps she must do the same. One day, a new line might rise to claim Highgarden's seat. But for now, She considered who among her allies possessed enough acumen and decency to rule in her stead. Standing on a balcony overlooking the sunlit rose gardens, mostly weeds now, Daenerys confided her thoughts to Grey Worm. "We need a caretaker for Highgarden. Someone respected enough not to be seen as a usurper, but loyal to me." Grey Worm nodded. "Have you anyone in mind?" Daenerys considered the lords who had bent the knee or proven themselves. Few had the deep connections to the Reach that would pacify the region's proud lords. She thought of Samwell Tarly, once a brother of the Night's Watch, son of Randall Tarly who had died in the war. Sam had always been kind, but he was in Old Town, last she heard, studying to be a maester. "I doubt Sam would wish to rule here," she said quietly. "Nor do I think the Reach would rally around him. His father's name was feared, and Sam is not that kind of man." She sighed. "We will have to find another solution." After a week of reorganizing Highgarden's defenses and sending ravens to the local lords, Daenerys prepared to return to King's Landing. She left a contingent of Unsullied under the command of a trusted officer, instructing them to keep the peace until she appointed a warden of the Reach. The tall rebel leader, still nursing his wounds, remained locked in the dungeons, awaiting a formal trial. She did not relish a public execution but knew justice must be served for his crimes. The people had to see that the crown did not hesitate to punish those who shed innocent blood. On the day she departed, she mounted Drogon amid the crumbling courtyard of Highgarden, the dusty rose sigils of House Tyrell still clinging to battered walls. Her knights and Dothraki assembled, some on horseback, others preparing wagons. The sun beat down on the once fertile fields, a reminder that the Reach still held the potential to feed the entire realm if properly managed. Daenerys vowed to ensure that potential was realized rather than squandered by rebellion or misrule. The flight back to King's Landing felt shorter, though the burden on her soul was heavier. She had subdued the golden harvest, but at the cost of more death. She had tried to minimize destruction, no wildfire, no mass burnings. Yet the knowledge that she had unleashed Drogon's flame again gnawed at her. Each battle risked fracturing the realm's fragile faith in her intentions. Each victory, however necessary, left new scars. By the time the capital's walls appeared on the horizon, dusk had settled, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. Daenerys spied the sprawl of King's Landing below, the Red Keep perched upon its hill. She noticed two silhouettes of dragons circling in the distance. She recognized them at once, Rhaegal and Viserion. A wave of relief and worry washed over her. They were together. Had they been fighting, or had they found some measure of camaraderie in her absence? She guided Drogon into a spiraling descent near the Red Keep's outer courtyard, where Missandei and her retinue awaited. The moment she dismounted, Missandei approached, bowing her head. "Your Grace, welcome home." Daenerys embraced her friend briefly, ignoring the stares of the onlookers. "Thank you. How fares the city?" Missandei's relief shone through her calm. "Better, Your Grace. The repairs continue, and we've had no major incidents. Rhaegal and Viserion have flown near the walls, but there have been no reports of violence. They even hunted together once, so the Watchers say." Daenerys exhaled, tension easing from her shoulders. "That is good news. I feared strife might break out in my absence." Missandei's smile was small but genuine. They seemed at ease, or at least more tolerant of each other. Daenerys glanced skyward. The shapes of Rhaegal and Viserion vanished into the twilight. She felt a stirring of gratitude that they had not torn the city apart or turned on each other. Perhaps her efforts were bearing fruit. Perhaps the bond she fought so hard to preserve was holding. Grey Worm joined them, and Daenerys led the way into the Red Keep. She was weary from the campaign, her armor dusty, hair tangled from the wind, but she refused to rest until she had spoken with her council. She recounted the campaign in the Reach, the captivity of the rebellion's leaders, and her plan to appoint a caretaker for Highgarden. Missandei and the other advisors agreed it was prudent, though the question of who would best fill that role remained unresolved. At last, the hour grew late. Daenerys retired to her chambers, too weary even to eat. She removed her armor with trembling fingers, letting it clatter onto a bench. A single lamp burned on the table, illuminating the cracked walls. She caught sight of her reflection in a tarnished mirror. Smoke-stained cloak, grime on her cheeks, purple shadows under her eyes. She hardly recognized the woman who had once walked through the red waste in threadbare rags. Yet she saw the same determination in those eyes, the same glimmer of hope that had led her across seas and deserts. She sank onto the edge of the bed, head in her hands. Dragons roamed the sky outside, shaping her destiny as much as she shaped theirs. The realm hung by a thread, balanced between fear and faith. She had to believe that each step, each act of mercy, each measured application of strength, would guide Westeros toward a future no longer defined by the ashes of war. At dawn, she awoke to news that Rhaegal and Viserion had roosted outside the western gate, side by side, as if standing guard. A hush had fallen over the city, neither fear nor reverence, but something in between. An acceptance that these creatures were not departing, that they belonged here, just as their mother did. Daenerys stepped onto the balcony of her chambers, gazing out at the sunrise that lit the city's roofs in golden light. Somewhere beyond the walls, Rhaegal and Viserion still perched, and Drogon undoubtedly soared, searching for the morning's first meal. She breathed in, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. She would face more challenges in the days to come, more rebellions, more political entanglements, more hearts to win or lose. But she had persevered thus far, forging a precarious peace among her dragons, breaking the golden harvest without turning the land into cinders, keeping her vow to the Iron Islands in the face of skepticism. All around her were the scars of a realm battered by centuries of turmoil. Yet she also saw green shoots pushing through rubble, new foundations laid atop old ruin. In that hopeful transformation, she found a reflection of her dragons, who had outgrown their hatchling rivalries to become formidable creatures capable of forging or shattering the future. Gently, she placed a hand over her heart, recalling the warmth she felt whenever she was close to them. No, the dragons had not been lost. Rhaegal and Viserion had survived against all odds, each carrying his own measure of ambition and pride. They challenged Drogon's place, yet they challenged her as well, to be a mother worthy of them, to be a queen who balanced steel and mercy. And Daenerys, for all her flaws and the blood on her hands, would not shrink from that challenge. She was Targaryen, heir to conquerors, but also the breaker of chains who once walked into fire for her children. She had claimed the Iron Throne not merely to sit upon it, but to reshape the realm into a kinder place, where dragons soared over fields that did not burn, and people lived in a measure of harmony. Perhaps it was an impossible dream, but every flap of dragon wings overhead reminded her that impossibilities could become real. She squared her shoulders and turned back into her chamber. Another day beckoned, full of tasks that would shape the realm's future. She would carry on, guided by the bond that refused to break, by the loyalty of her friends, and by the memory of all she had lost. The realm was hers to protect. The dragons were hers to love. And so she would move forward, one breath at a time, forging a new destiny from the embers of the old.